this is going to be an attempt to make myself a bow. And this is going to be a little bit of a video series. I'm going to go through the entire process of me making it, but it's not an expert series by any means. It's going to be basically a beginner series, kind of showing anybody out there who was ever in the point that I'm at right now. They always wanted to make a bow, but never started. So it's kind of just motivation for those kinds of people. I know there's probably a ton out there that you just got to get out there and start. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I have a little bit of information, but basically I'm just going. So the first thing is I picked this pignut hickory tree to cut down. I had to identify the tree. This is a pignut hickory tree. You can't identify it just by the bark alone. It is a little bit more difficult than some of the other hickory trees like shagbark hickory to just identify it through the bark. But if you look on the ground, you should be able to find these pignuts. And this is really the way that I identified this tree. These are pretty easy to spot. I mean, there's a ton of them all over the place. So if you find these, you're definitely close to a pignut hickory tree, and you can use that for bow building. Hickory, any types of hickory is a pretty good type of wood to make a bow out of. There's other ones that are better. I think if you know anything or have researched bow making at all, you probably have heard of Osage orange. It's probably the most common and best bow wood, but that is an expensive wood to buy, a bow stave. And as a beginner, it's better if you go out and just cut down a tree. You can look online, make sure that it's not going to make a bow that doesn't work or that breaks, but there's a lot of different woods out there that can make a functioning bow. So that's what I looked for. And aside from the type of wood, you're also looking at kind of the way it has grown. You're looking for knots. You don't want anything with knots. You're looking for straightness. You're also looking for the diameter of the tree. This is fairly large, probably like over 12 inches, and that's pretty large for bow making. But the larger you go, the less crown the back of your bow is going to have. So when you make a bow, the back of the bow is going to be on the outside here after you remove the bark, and the more crown it has, or the more arch that has, the more stress is on a single point along that back. So it is a little bit better to go a little bit bigger in diameter, and I think they say anywhere above 6 inches is okay. 8 inches, you're getting into a pretty good, that's a fairly good size for making any bow out of. The last thing I think that's really important is if the tree has spiral in it. Sometimes you can tell by the bark, sometimes you can't, but you're going to want to avoid any tree with spiral. Some of those bends and stuff you can take out later by bending them and heating them and steaming them later, but if you can avoid that, you might as well start from a good start rather than starting your first time with a difficult piece of wood. So I think we're going to find out if this one has spiral in it, but from like I say, it's tough to tell from the bark sometimes, but it looks pretty decent right now. It looks like it grew pretty straight. So so now that you got it cut down, we're gonna go ahead and split it. And basically the only thing about splitting that you have to know is only split it in half. Do not try to split a third off or a quarter off. If you try to do that, you want both your pieces to be the pieces that come off to be the same size. That way it'll split right down the center. If you try to go to one side and cut 3/4 and 1/4 off, then the side that's larger, the 3/4 side, will push the crack to the other side, and you'll end up having the crack run right off the side. So you won't get all the way through necessarily, or you'll end up with a really skinny end and a really fat end. So always split it down the middle, and basically you're going to want to have a couple wedges. So I got a few here. We're going to see how this goes, but we already have a crack started right here from when I cut it, and we're just going to try to keep that crack going and split this down the center. Alright, so here's my pile of staves. I ended up with nine different staves. Most of them, there's 7 that are an eighth of what the tree was, and then there's one of those eighths I actually split into a 16th. So this is how wide most of them are, about a little over 4 inches. You can see that, so that's an eighth cut, and then this one's a 16th. So I think this is honestly too small, too thin. But you know, this is what you get to try. Didn't really hurt much trying that because you know, this is wood that I cut myself. They are a little long, they're 7 foot, but that'll give me room to cut some off. So, but you can kind of see what I'm working with here. For the most part, all these staves turned out with no propeller twist. That's really good. Pretty happy about that. And really, you can see here, there's a curve to it. That's called reflex. When it's curving back towards the bark like that, and kind of backwards towards the back, this bark side is going to be the back of the bow. That's called reflex, and that's actually a good thing. Pretty much all of them have a little bit of reflex after they got split out, so that's good. I also split some of the heartwood. You can see a pile of it over here. I split some of the heartwood off, and same idea. You just kind of work your way. You know, there was a piece like that long into a triangle over here. I went right here and split that off, and I just worked the wedges down it just like you saw me do before. So I'm gonna get these back to the house, and we're gonna continue working on them. All right, so I got the staves back to the house, and most of them are down in the basement already. These two are some of the better ones. These two are pretty thin, but they're not too thin like the ones that I split down to a 16th of the piece of wood. So my idea is that these two are probably going to be some of the faster drying ones, and I'll be able to work with them a little bit quicker. They are really straight, and they have a little bit of reflex, so they're really good pieces. They're really good staves, and I'm going to do an experiment because they're so similar. So all the pieces of wood, I will have to seal this end grain, because basically the fibers run this way, and there's a bunch of little holes basically in this end grain. So it lets a lot of moisture out quickly, and when this lets a lot of moisture out quickly, it shrinks, but the rest of the wood hasn't, and it pulls this apart, and that's what develops cracks in the end. So we got to seal that, make sure it doesn't dry too quickly. But you really have to do that with pretty much all wood. So the other thing with hickory, though, it's really resistant to cracking, and they say you can take the bark off before you let them dry, and if you harvest them in the springtime, the bark comes off really easily. So one of these, I'm going to take the bark off. Hopefully it doesn't crack, and it should dry very, very quickly. And the other one, I'm going to leave the bark on. It's going to take a little bit longer to dry, and but I'll still seal the ends, and hopefully that one won't crack either. So we're going to give that a shot, and I'll show you how I go about it. Alright, so the tool I'm using is just a draw knife. If you don't have one, you're probably going to want to get one, because you're going to need one for the rest of the bow making process anyway. But for this part, basically the back of the bow is going to be this sapwood here, and so where this turns from a really white color to this darker red, That's like the inner bark layer, and we're going to take all that off and just expose the first ring of sapwood. So hopefully it comes off easily, like they say, because it was cut down in the spring. Alright, so here's my first attempt at backing a bow stave, and the bark came off, you know, it wasn't terribly hard, but it definitely wasn't easy. It took a little bit of time, but I'm pretty happy with how this turned out because I've watched other YouTube videos of guys who do this all the time, and this is exactly what it looks like. It's got this dark and light stripes to it. And something I noticed that I've never heard anybody say is this underbark here, before it gets exposed, it's this really light yellowish color, and then it's hard to tell the difference between the actual sapwood and this underbark, but if you let it sit for a little bit, it must have some iron in it, and when it gets exposed to oxygen, it oxidizes and rusts basically, so it turns this dark red color. So what I kind of noticed was I might have thought I was kind of getting close at some sections. I'd leave it sit for a little bit to flip it around, and then I'd see how dark it got and how much farther I had to go. So that was a really easy way to judge how far I was. But all in all, pretty happy with how this turned out, and now I gotta go seal the ends, and we're gonna wait for this to dry and hopefully it doesn't crack. Alright, so the last thing to do for a while here is just seal the ends of these staves, and I got a bucket of wax melted here. So all I'm gonna do is take the end of here, dip it in there, swirl that wax around, get it up, and you can see kind of coats about an inch or two up the sides and all along the bottom. I'll flip it around. And that's it. Now these just sit in the corner to dry for a while. Alright, so I got all my staves sealed up, and they're propped up here in the basement. But I used wax. You don't necessarily have to use wax. There's a lot of commercial sealing products out there that are designed for this. Wax works well. I'm sure the ones that are designed for sealing wood, I'm sure they work. You can also use paint. Some paints allow more moisture through than others. I know latex paint seals it up pretty well, so you can use that. So I mentioned earlier that hickory has a good resistance to cracking, and that's why I wanted to try this one, debarking it and seeing if it cracked or not. But if you're using a different kind of wood that isn't as resistant to cracking, you can still take the bark off when the wood is wet, and you can paint this surface, just to try to stop cracks from developing in that. Same thing, but other than that, these are just going to sit here in the basement. It's pretty cool down here. You don't want to put them in anywhere that's really hot. If you try to dry them too fast, most likely they're going to crack, unless they're in a really controlled, like dehumidifying box or something. But these are going to sit here. This one's probably going to be the one that dries the fastest, so we'll probably be able to work with that one soonest. If it does start developing cracks, I have 7 feet here that I can kind of chop off if need be, and that's why I made them so long. So in the meantime, while these are drying, I'm going to get prepared for the rest of the bow making process. I need a tiller machine, and so I'm going to make one of those, and that'll be my next video. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching.